The moment my brother laughed at my son's tears, in front of everyone, I knew something inside me had snapped. That night, I decided to end 8 years of being the family's wallet. And trust me, I didn't just cut them off. I erased them. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 40 years old, a single father, and a cybersecurity analyst living in Austin, Texas. On paper, life looks stable: suburban townhouse, decent job, quiet evenings with my 12-year-old son Noah. But behind that calm exterior, I've been quietly funding my family's entire existence for nearly a decade. Every Friday, like clockwork, $700 left my account, my parents' mortgage payment. Then came my younger brother Brandon, who I loaned $75,000 to start his dream business, Cole Custom Furniture. A logo, an Instagram page, and 2 unfinished coffee tables later, the dream evaporated. He still drives the truck I bought him, a matte black Ford F-150 that I paid off while eating microwaved ramen during my divorce. See, that's the thing about family. They always say we're in this together, but somehow you're always the one footing the bill. After my marriage collapsed, my parents took my ex-wife's side. "Ethan, you chose work over love," my mom said. Dad sighed. "A woman can only take being ignored for so long, son." They weren't entirely wrong. I was building a new cybersecurity department for a major finance company. 12-hour days, constant travel. But I was doing it for them, for my family. When my father got sick 2 years later, I didn't hesitate. I paid every medical bill, even when insurance denied half the treatments. I told myself it was my way to make things right. But somehow, the more I gave, the less they respected me. They started treating me like a service, not a son. And Brandon, he treated me like his personal ATM. It all came to a head one blistering Sunday afternoon, Brandon's 35th birthday. The Cole family backyard was filled with cheap beer, country music, and the thick smell of barbecue smoke. Brandon's buddies were already half drunk, tossing beanbags and shouting football scores. My son Noah sat beside me on the backseat of the car, holding a small blue gift box in his hands. He'd spent 3 weeks building what he called the perfect present for Uncle Brandon. He'd sanded, carved, and varnished a wooden phone dock, crafted from reclaimed oak we found at a flea market. I'd helped him a little with the laser engraver at my office, etching Brandon's initials, BC, on the corner. Noah had even tied a silver ribbon around it himself. When we got there, I could feel that familiar tension, the way my family always made me feel like an outsider in my own bloodline. "Ethan, you made it," my mom chirped. "And you brought your work phone, I bet?" I smiled faintly, just in case. Dad laughed from his lawn chair. "That's our Ethan, married to the job." It was always jokes like that, harmless on the surface, but each one chipped away at the part of me that still believed I belonged. As Brandon strutted around with a beer in hand, Noah tugged my sleeve. "Can I give it to him now, Dad?" "Go ahead, buddy," I said. Noah walked over, holding out the box with both hands. "Happy birthday, Uncle Brandon." Brandon grinned, took it, and tore off the ribbon dramatically. The laughter died down for a moment. Everyone watched. He opened the box, stared at the carved wood dock, then snorted. "What's this?" he said loudly. "A middle school shop project?" His friends chuckled. Noah's smile faltered. "I made it for your desk. You can put your phone on it." Brandon smirked, lifted the dock like it was some kind of joke. "You think I got time for this cheap junk?" Then, without warning, he tossed it. The dock struck Noah's chest and hit the ground with a dull crack. Laughter exploded. Even my parents chuckled awkwardly. My mom waved a hand. "Oh, Brandon, stop. He's just a kid." Dad muttered, "He'll toughen up." Noah's eyes shimmered. He crouched to pick it up, but a piece had splintered. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, slow, deep, irreversible. I didn't yell, didn't curse. I just stood up and looked my brother dead in the eye. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Brandon." He rolled his eyes, smirking. "What? You gonna ground me, big brother?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm just done paying for your mistakes." Then I turned to my parents. "And yours." The laughter stopped. I took Noah's hand and walked out of that backyard. No one followed. That night, Noah sat beside me on the couch, still quiet, Dad, he whispered, did I do something wrong? I put my arm around him. No, son. You did everything right. You gave love to people who didn't deserve it. He leaned against me, and for the first time in years, I felt both fury and clarity in equal measure. That night, while he slept, I sat at my computer, staring at the spreadsheet I'd kept for years. Mortgage transfers, medical payments, loans to Brandon, grocery reimbursements. Over $280,000. All of it, gone into people who laughed at my kid. That's when I made a quiet promise to myself. If they want to see what happens when the family ATM stops working, I'll show them. And trust me, I didn't stop at just cutting them off. I made sure they'd feel the loss, not in their wallets, but in their pride. Because sometimes revenge isn't about ruining someone's life. It's about reminding them you were the one keeping it together. That night after the barbecue, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Noah's face. The shock, the hurt, the confusion. That look of betrayal on a child's face doesn't fade. It imprints on your soul. By morning, the anger had cooled into something far sharper clarity. I brewed my coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened my bank dashboard. Every automatic transfer, my parents' mortgage, Brandon's business expenses, utilities, all neatly categorized, recurring, predictable. They thought I'd never stop. I moved the cursor over the recurring payments tab, hovered for a second, and clicked cancel all. It felt like cutting oxygen lines. Silent. Final. 3 days later, the first text arrived from Mom. MOM. Honey, mortgage didn't go through this month. Probably a bank glitch. I stared at it. Normally I'd reply within minutes. This time, I let it sit. 6 hours later, another one. MOM Ethan? Your dad's worried. Please call. Then Dad chimed in. Dad. Son, we know you're busy, but we're getting late fees. Please fix this. I typed and deleted a dozen replies. Finally, I just sent one word. No. The phone rang immediately. I let it ring out. Then came Brandon. Brandon, bro, what's going on? My truck payment bounced. You cancel something. I stared at his message and felt a flicker of dark satisfaction. Yes. Brandon, you serious? Dude, you know I got orders coming in. You can't just... What orders? You haven't sold a table in 2 years. There was a long pause before his reply. Brandon, you're really doing this over some stupid kid's toy. That line hit like a hammer. A stupid kid's toy. I didn't answer. I blocked his number. For the first time in years, my phone was silent. No guilt-ridden urgent calls. No sudden cash requests. Just peace. But peace didn't last long. A week later, I got a notice from the bank. Someone had tried to access my joint emergency account, the one I'd created for family medical expenses. It had my name and my father's. They drained $8,000 before the system flagged unusual activity. I called the bank. Freeze the account, I said. Immediately. When I asked for transaction details, the representative hesitated. Sir, these withdrawals went through from your co-account holder. There's nothing technically illegal. Technically. That word burned. I checked the account history. Every transfer led to one place, Brandon's name. I leaned back, staring at the monitor, pulse pounding in my ears. That's when it hit me. They hadn't just used me. They'd planned to. That night, I drove to my parents' house, the same one I'd been paying off for 8 years. The porch light was on, flickering. I could hear laughter from the living room. When I knocked, Mom opened the door with her usual half-forced smile. Oh, honey, you finally decided to visit, she said, like nothing had happened. I stepped inside. Dad was watching TV. Brandon sat on the couch, beer in hand, acting like he owned the place. Ethan, Dad said, without looking up, I told your mother this whole payment thing was a misunderstanding. I stared at him. Misunderstanding? You mean the part where you and Brandon stole $8,000 from me? Brandon scoffed. Stole. It was family money. You set it up for emergencies. That account was for Dad's hospital bills, not your truck tires. He smirked. Relax, man. You're loaded. You act like we robbed a bank. I took a slow breath. You did worse. You robbed trust. Mom stepped in between us. Ethan, please, let's not fight. We're family. I looked around that room. The furniture I bought, the TV I paid for, the air conditioner humming because of my money. Family, I said quietly. You only call it that when you need something. For a second, no one spoke. The silence was louder than any shouting could have been. Then I said it, calm, deliberate, final. Enjoy the house while you can. The bank will be calling soon. Dad's face paled. What are you talking about? I canceled the auto pay. The mortgage is in your name now. You've got 30 days before it defaults. Mom gasped. Brandon shot up. You can't do that. I turned to him. I just did. Then I walked out, leaving their stunned silence behind me. That drive home felt freeing. The night air hit different, crisp, electric. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their weight. But the next morning, freedom came with a cost. A letter was taped to my front door. No return address, just my name scrawled in all caps, Ethan. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed screenshot. It was my employment contract, annotated with red circles around certain clauses. Non-compete, conflict of interest, data privacy. Below, someone had typed, "Wonder what your boss would think if he knew you were using company software for side jobs." My stomach dropped. That was Brandon's handwriting. It wasn't true. I never used work tools for freelancing. But the accusation alone could destroy my reputation. That's when I realized my family wasn't going to let me walk away quietly. They wanted to make me pay, the same way I had made them feel powerless. But they underestimated one thing. I knew how to cover my tracks. And more importantly, I knew how to expose theirs. That evening, I sat down at my desk and opened a new, encrypted folder. Inside, I started collecting everything: receipts, bank statements, text logs, email chains, years of small favors, and temporary loans. Each one was a nail in their coffin. I wasn't going to the police. No, that would be too easy. Too visible. I wanted something quieter. Something poetic. They had built their comfort on my name, my credit, my trust. So I would take that name away from them, one signature at a time. And when I was done, they wouldn't just lose my money. They'd lose the illusion that they ever had control. When you work in cybersecurity for a living, you learn to think in layers. What's visible on the surface, what's buried underneath, and what happens if you pull a single thread. Revenge, it turned out, was a lot like threat modeling. You don't smash. You exploit existing weaknesses and let the structure fail under its own weight. I spent the first week doing the invisible work. Not because I enjoyed it, because it was surgical. I would not be the guy who screamed in the street. I would be the patient hand that turned the screws. My first move was obvious and legal: paper. I requested certified copies of every loan, every lien, every document where my name appeared as guarantor. Those records don't hide. They live in county clerks' offices and banking backends, and they bore my signature in places I hadn't glanced at for years. The more I pulled, the clearer the pattern. Petty withdrawals from the emergency fund, cash advances into Brandon's business account, dozens of small reimbursements labeled groceries that went straight into his PayPal. My money was a river feeding at least 3 lives that had never returned the favor. I could have called a lawyer. I could have gone to the bank and demanded immediate audits. But lawyers cost money, and public fights attract sympathy. I wanted a quieter collapse, the kind of humiliation that hits when people realize their comfort depends on a single, deliberate flick of a switch. So I used my strengths. I set up audit flags at the bank, formally queried questionable transfers, and asked for tracebacks. Not hacking, just a pro's command of paperwork, of process, of turning the right levers in systems most people don't know exist. I filed affidavits where necessary, proved misuse, and left a paper trail that looked less like vengeance and more like routine bank compliance. Compliance hates irregularity. Institutions act fast when regulatory red flags light up. At the same time, I started securing my life. I tightened accounts, rotated passwords, and moved emergency funds into accounts with strict 2-factor controls. That part had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with peace. For once, there was no autopay to think about, no midnight panic when a rent withdrawal failed, I slept like a man who'd finally removed a splinter. Then I turned to Brandon's collateral. He'd put the truck, the matte black F-150, up as collateral on a short-term business line. It was listed clearly on loan documents, and the loan agent's contact at the dealer was someone I knew professionally. A single phone call, a certified notice of default filed under the correct terms, and I did what I told him I would. I enforced the contract. Because I'd prepared. I'd kept every invoice he'd ever sent me, every urgent text, the Instagram photos of the mock storefront that had once looked real. I walked into the repo company's office on a Tuesday morning and left with a pickup scheduled at 10 a.m. on Thursday. No theatrics. A flatbed. 2 men in vests, the kind of efficient, mechanical finality that turns swagger into a memory. When the truck left his driveway with a clank of chains, the look on his face was not the smirk I'd become used to. It was the raw astonishment of a man who'd assumed the world would absorb his failures. He chased the vehicle for 2 blocks before it turned the corner. On the porch, his buddies gaped. In his mouth, the beer tasted suddenly like ash. He didn't yell. He just stood there, the sudden emptiness of not owning the truck heavier on him than any physical loss. Repossession did 2 things. Practically, it removed a visible sign of the life he'd been pretending to maintain. Psychologically, it punctured the illusion that I was inexhaustible. Next, I switched to leverage. I prepared envelopes. Not angry letters, but dry, well-presented documents. Notices of default to landlords, formal demand letters for unpaid vendor invoices, audited statements to utility companies showing missed payments. I printed the auction receipt for the repo and slipped it into an envelope addressed to my parents' mortgage servicer. I mailed copies of the bank audit, the evidence of the misdirected funds from the emergency account, to the lender on Brandon's merchant line and the county clerk. People don't crumble from violence. They crumble from consequences landing in their mailbox that they cannot ignore or charm away. The landlord posted a 3-day pay or quit notice on the pottery storefront within a week. The power company scheduled a shutoff for overdue commercial accounts. Friends began asking awkward questions at the market, where Brandon tried to hawk chip bowls for cash. And then there was the smallest, meanest thing I did. I stopped answering. When the calls came, the frantic ones at first, I let them go to voicemail. The pleading, the bargaining, the threats stacked up into a pile of noise I didn't have to wade through. He sent me a link to a GoFundMe he'd started. I scrolled past it. He called my office from a block number at 2 a.m. I turned on the Do Not Disturb and let the voicemail live as evidence of desperation. Brandon tried other strategies. He tried public humiliation, standing outside my workplace with a cardboard sign that read, "My sister's money ruined my life." He showed up at local bars and told anyone who would listen that I was a heartless brother. For a while, the neighborhood gossip cycle hummed. But gossip is noise without documentation. I had receipts. I had dates. I had facts. The twist came when I found the small camera on my parents' porch. Not mine, not installed by me. A cheap motion sensor cam, pointed at the front yard. It had captured a late-night exchange between my father and a local pawnshop owner. Cash changing hands under a streetlight, a grimace from Clyde as he counted bills, and a receipt being folded into a pocket. I sat there, watching the grainy footage, and realizing the complicity ran deeper than pride or arrogance. They had agency, and they'd chosen convenience. That footage changed everything. It meant their financial strain wasn't simply the result of bad luck. It was a set of choices, and choices have consequences. So I mailed a copy of that footage to their motel office with a succinct note. This is the last time I will pay for intentional choices. No rhetoric, a simple fact. I sent another copy to the caseworker at the clinic that handled Dad's diabetes care, not because I wanted to hurt him medically, but because the paper trail needed to be clear. We had tried help. They had chosen otherwise. By the end of the month, the household that had once relied on me was unspooling. Brandon's kiln was cold. The pottery shop's Instagram still glowed with curated shots of empty shelves. Real customers were scarce. The mortgage servicer had scheduled a foreclosure consultation. My parents' motel was past its 30-day prepaid stay. The clerk had left a polite voicemail about overdue balances. And here's the thing I kept reminding myself when the nights felt heavy. None of this was personal cruelty. It was accountability. They had been allowed to amass comfort on the back of my labor and trust. I had the right, and arguably, the duty to my son, to unbind myself. Noah watched it happen from the safe side of the glass. He didn't revel in it. He watched with that wary, widening curiosity children get when they realize adults are fallible, and rules sometimes change. He asked one question once, more practical than rhetorical. "Are they going to be okay, Dad?" I made him breakfast and answered honestly. "They'll survive. It'll be different. But this time, you and I are safe." He nodded, accepting it the way children do, as the ending of one story and the start of another. At night, the street outside my house felt emptier, but quieter in a way that felt like patience, like a storm after the wind dies down. I had engineered the collapse, but I never lost sight of the moment when the storm would be over. That was the end game, not to watch them burn, but to step away while they had to reckon with what their choices had cost them. I hadn't closed the book. I'd only turned the page. The real test, and the part that would expose character more than papers, was still to come. The week after Brandon's truck disappeared, the reality of the collapse began to settle over their lives, like dust after a storm. I watched from my home office, not out of spite, but because this was the only way to ensure my son, Noah, and I stayed safe. The quiet was necessary. Revenge had been methodical, but now it had to be observed to ensure it served its purpose, not just my pride. Brandon had started showing up at the pottery shop later in the mornings. The once bright spark of entrepreneurial energy replaced with heavy-lidded exhaustion. The kiln remained cold. The paint on the storefront sign began to peel under the relentless Tucson sun. I had blocked all auto payments, bills mounted. It was no longer a game. It was accountability. Each missed payment was a lesson etched in the hard reality of consequences. He tried everything: small pop-up stands, local art fairs, even delivering a few handcrafted mugs to nearby cafes. The problem wasn't talent, it was foundation. He had built his life on borrowed credit, borrowed trust, borrowed energy. Once the support system collapsed, so did the facade. I received the first of what I expected would be many desperate voicemails late one night. His voice, raw with panic and frustration, left no room for doubt. "Ethan, please. I can fix this. Just give me a chance. I'll pay double. Please. Don't ruin me." I let the message sit unheard. I had learned a long time ago that messages like that are only useful to someone who is willing to admit fault, and Brandon wasn't. He believed that persistence could override accountability. It couldn't. Meanwhile, my parents continued to spiral, though I had insulated Noah and me from their chaos. Their motel room was small, the cheap neon lights flickering outside the window as the desert night settled in. I had stopped paying the rent, and they had exhausted their savings far too quickly. Clyde's diabetes care became complicated without my steady payments. Marlene found herself constantly apologizing to cashiers for shortchanging groceries. It was heartbreaking in its way, but not the kind of heartbreak that could harm me. It was the kind that comes from realizing life finally mirrors the choices you've made. I kept meticulous records of everything: emails, bank statements, timestamps of payments, screenshots of the voicemails and texts. These weren't tools for revenge anymore. They were a shield, a way to ensure that if Brandon or my parents tried to manipulate me legally, I had evidence of their actions and the consequences they had caused themselves. It felt cold, clinical, and yet necessary. One evening, after Noah had gone to bed, I received a letter postmarked Tucson. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Brandon's handwriting was familiar, shaky, desperate. It read like a confession and a plea. "Ethan, I see it now. I took advantage of you. I thought family meant I could take without giving. I was wrong. Please, I'll make it right. I'll work for you. Repay every cent. Don't let this be the end." I read it twice. The words were meaningless without action. By now, actions had defined reality, not promises. I folded the letter once, placed it on the counter, and walked away. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about maintaining boundaries. 2 days later, the certified letters started arriving: foreclosure notices, overdue utility accounts, and final warnings from suppliers Brandon had ignored. The kiln had gone cold, the shelves empty, and the few paying customers dwindled. Even the Yelp reviews were merciless, neutral posts noting lack of stock, slow response, and disappearing customer service. Each item was a calculated ripple, and I watched the pond settle without needing to step into it. The law and logistics did the work I had set in motion. Noah, for his part, began to understand in small ways what had happened. One morning, as he worked on a school project, he asked quietly, "Dad, will they ever understand why we stopped helping them?" I watched him hold the glue stick, his fingers sticky with care, and nodded. "Maybe someday. But what matters is we understand. Family isn't about using each other for comfort or money. It's about trust. When that trust is broken, sometimes you have to protect yourself." He nodded again, and that was enough. He didn't need the entire narrative. He only needed to see that boundaries mattered. 3 weeks later, I drove past the pottery shop. Brandon's F-150 was gone, the driveway empty. I slowed at the corner, glimpsed him through the dusty storefront windows. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, glancing at a tablet, a small stack of unsold pottery around him. There was no dramatic gesture, no shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet resignation of someone facing the consequences of years of mismanagement. I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and melancholy. This wasn't joy in another's suffering. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the scales had finally leveled. He had choices to make now, and they were his alone. I didn't gloat, I observed. There's a lesson in restraint. True power is not in crushing. It's in letting someone experience their own reality. My parents had also begun to recalibrate their lives. The motel stay ended. They moved into a small apartment closer to the city's outskirts. Clyde managed insulin appointments, though Marlene had to pick up extra shifts at the dollar store. There was no dramatic confrontation, no further begging. Instead, a slow, grinding reality that mirrored their choices. I watched all of it unfold from my home office, the city lights reflecting off my screen. I had rebuilt a life insulated from their greed. Noah was thriving. He was healthy, curious, and learning that protection and love sometimes mean making hard decisions. Months passed. The pottery shop was sold at auction, the final hammer price a fraction of what Brandon had imagined. The F-150 had been repossessed and resold. Brandon tried to contact me once more, sending a single email with the subject, "I'm sorry." I didn't open it. Actions, not words, had defined everything. Noah asked me one evening, sitting at the kitchen counter with a cereal bowl in hand, "Dad, do you ever miss them?" I paused, thinking of the splintered gifts, the pounding at the door, the endless pleas. I looked out the window at the foothills, the orange light of the desert setting in. "I miss who I thought they were," I said, "but not what they became." He nodded. That was enough. We had our peace. Our life was ours to build, smaller, yes, but stronger, freer. The lesson had been hard, bitter even. But it stuck. Family isn't an ATM, trust isn't infinite, and peace isn't given, it's protected. In the quiet that followed, I let myself finally exhale. The bills I had been paying for years no longer dictated my days. The auto payments no longer stole my sleep. The voicemail notifications had ceased. And in that silence, I realized the true power of boundaries. They protect not just your money, but your life, your sanity, and your child's future. Brandon would rebuild, or he wouldn't. That was no longer my concern. My concern was the life I had fought to preserve, a life free from manipulation, full of trust, honesty, and respect. And for the first time in nearly a decade, I felt fully, completely untethered. The weeks after the pottery shop's final auction were strangely calm. Tucson mornings held a soft glow, and my office overlooked the quiet street where I had spent so many anxious hours managing autopays, monitoring bank alerts, and documenting the fallout of years of misplaced trust. Noah had returned to his usual energy, drawing, building Lego cities, asking endless questions about everything from coding loops to desert wildlife. He didn't dwell on the past, and I was learning to do the same. The quiet, however, wasn't the absence of consequence. It was the presence of clarity. Brandon had reached the end of his resources. The F-150, repossessed and resold, was gone. The kiln remained cold. Yelp reviews and social media posts captured the narrative. A small business that collapsed under mismanagement and debt. For all his cleverness, he hadn't accounted for accountability. Life has a way of enforcing balance when the leverage is stripped. My parents, meanwhile, were living in a modest apartment on the north side of town. Clyde shuffled with a cane, carefully monitoring his insulin, and Marlene worked part-time at a grocery store. They had no more plastic flamingos, no freshly stocked AC, no easy Wi-Fi. I had stopped subsidizing their lifestyle, and the consequences were visible but measured. I wasn't cruel. I had simply removed myself from enabling their choices. Actions have consequences, and they were learning that in the hardest school reality. One afternoon, as I was reviewing code for a remote deployment, Noah came into my office holding a small wooden box. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and curiosity. "Dad, look," he said. "I fixed it." I glanced down to see the splintered pottery box, the one Brandon had thrown years ago, now sanded smooth, hinges replaced and varnished. Kendall's handiwork from countless afternoons had transformed it into something stronger, something resilient. I smiled. "That's incredible," I said. "You've turned something broken into something beautiful." He grinned, and I realized that lesson wasn't lost on him. Life would break things. We could either let them remain shattered, or we could rebuild. That was a truth far more valuable than any inheritance, any family tie, or any misguided trust. The first encounter with Brandon after the fallout was deliberate. It wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated. I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small cafe near downtown Tucson. He arrived late, a shadow of the swaggering man who had once thrown a handcrafted box across a yard like it was trash. His shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, but there was a faint attempt at charm that felt almost pathetic. "Ethan, I know you don't want to hear it, but I need to say I'm sorry," he said, voice low. I see now everything I took from you, everything I ignored. I messed up." I leaned back, arms crossed, silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. "I hear your words," I said finally, "but words aren't what cost you your business, your truck, or the freedom you thought you had. Actions are, and your actions caught up to you." He swallowed, nodding, understanding without needing me to elaborate. There was humility in defeat, a lesson that no amount of charm or pleading could erase. He left that cafe quietly, a man confronting the full measure of his choices for the first time. Even my parents eventually reached a similar reckoning. One evening, Marlene called, her voice quieter than I remembered. "Ethan, we're managing. Dad's doing better with his meds. We understand now." I didn't chastise. I didn't lecture. I simply listened. "Good," I said. "We all have to manage our own choices. I hope you keep doing it." That was enough. The lesson had landed. Stability cannot be borrowed indefinitely. Support must be reciprocal, not automatic. Family isn't a blank check. Meanwhile, life at home for Noah and me was rebuilding in its own way. We redecorated his room, added shelving for his growing collection of models and Lego sets, and spent weekends exploring the Catalina foothills. I found joy in small victories. Breakfast cooked without interruption, walks to the park without tension, evenings spent reading instead of monitoring messages or bank alerts. Peace had a new texture, soft, steady, and earned. At work, I thrived. Without the constant drain of family obligations, I had more energy for challenging deployments, mentoring new engineers, and even leading a small open-source project. My reputation grew. My stock options vested. I even started hosting virtual game nights with friends, laughter echoing in my home, unburdened by past drama. Noah participated, giggling at the absurdity of my poor gaming skills, and I felt something I hadn't in years, contentment. Months later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address. I recognized Brandon's handwriting instantly. I hesitated before opening it, expecting another plea. Instead, it was short and direct. "Ethan, I'm rebuilding. Slowly. I'll never forget what happened. Thank you, in a way, for showing me the cost of my choices." I read it, folded it, and tucked it away. No response was necessary. Accountability had spoken louder than words ever could. Noah watched me one morning while I packed tools in the garage. "Dad, do you ever miss them?" he asked, referring to Brandon and my parents. I paused, considering the years of chaos, the splintered boxes, the midnight pounding, the unpaid bills. I looked out at the desert light spilling over the foothills. I miss who I thought they were, I said finally, but not who they turned out to be. And we have our life. That's what matters. He nodded, understanding in his own way. I watched him return to his Lego creations, focused and content. That was enough. The final lesson became clear over time. Life isn't about family by blood alone. It's about trust, reciprocity, and boundaries. I had spent years giving endlessly, until I realized that giving without limit was a form of erosion. I had rebuilt, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The result was a life free from exploitation, rich in quiet joys and meaningful relationships. Peace came in subtle ways. Mornings without autopay alerts, evenings without frantic voicemails, weekends without tension. Noah thrived in the environment I had fought to protect. Brandon and my parents faced their consequences, slow and inevitable, but fair. And I had rebuilt a home, a heart, and a rhythm that no one could unsettle. Looking back, the truth was simple. Boundaries are the strongest inheritance you can give your child. Protect your peace. Protect your family. Protect your trust. Everything else is optional. And as I watched the sun dip behind Catalina Mountains, Noah's laughter echoing from the garage, where he built yet another small creation, I finally understood the quiet, ultimate power of justice. Not dramatic, not loud, but measured, deliberate, and complete.